Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
I'm Zevin Odelberg, and this is Kinda Murdery. Wishing you all a restful Sunday evening or a smooth as chocolate pudding Monday morning. Point is, whenever you happen to be listening, I hope things are going just swimmingly for you. We're here at part 2 of Thursday's story about the shooting of Patrolman Masterson, so if you haven't heard part 1 yet, go back and listen to it. As I often do, I will rewind the story just a bit to let you settle back into the narrative. Let's get right to it. Kinda Murderies. It was a face out of hell. The shooting of Patrolman Masterson, part 2, starts now. Whitey threaten you? Martin asked. Linehan didn't answer, and in silence they traveled until they reached the corner cafe on West 23rd Street near the ferries. It was an old-time saloon. The bar was being used as a quick lunch counter. Martin and Linehan passed the entrance and entered the vestibule of a tenement that had been built over the grog shop. They hoofed it up to the second floor and there found Bolton presiding over a thickly crowded brand new bar. It was one of those speakeasies that abounded along the waterfront and persisted in spite of steadily demolishing raiders. Bolton was a powerful, ruddy-faced chap with eyes as guileless as a baby's and a simulated genial expression. He was the opposite of Linehan, who was a sharp-featured, cynical-looking fellow with cruel thin lips and deep-set black eyes. "I think it would be better if I spoke to Bolton alone," Linehan said nervously, glancing around the room. "Well, that's all right with me," Detective Martin said, and sat down at a small, liquor-stained round table. Linehan took a place at the end of the bar, which was deserted by the boisterous patrons, who were crowding chummily at the end nearest the door. Glancing at his watch, Detective Martin saw that the hands pointed to 6:30. He ordered a glass of small beer and slipped into the telephone booth. So loud were the wisecracks and accompanying raucous laughter coming from the great husky longshoreman that Detective Martin had to cup the mouthpiece before Central could hear the number he gave. When he was connected with Inspector Coughlin, he told him that he was busily following up a lead that promised developments. "Masterson died at 6:20, the inspector said when Martin had finished. "Get in touch with Donahue." It's strange how small trifles can assume importance at tragic times. Masterson must have died without regaining consciousness, so they couldn't tell him that the thugs didn't get his badge. That hurts a cop's feelings more than a bullet, even if the shield is swiped when he is lying helpless, as Masterson was. Well, if Masterson's brother cops couldn't catch his murderer, it wouldn't be for lack of trying. Detective Martin approached Bolton and Linehan, determined not to have any more shilly-shallying on the part of the club owner. "Bolton made a mistake," Linehan started to say blandly through lips that barely moved as he spoke. His shifty eyes regarded Martin slyly as if trying to see whether he believed the statement. "Well," Martin said grimly, "mistakes are serious things in a murder case. Masterson died 15 minutes ago. Come on, Bolton. Put on your coat and come to headquarters with me." Wait a minute, Linehan protested, his tongue moistening his dry lips. "What I was going to say is that Bolton made a mistake in not getting in touch with me immediately and reminding me that Whitey was the man I introduced to him. He recalled the incident to my mind. I'll just telephone and get a hold of the man who introduced him to me." Beneath Linehan's cold, self-contained pose, Detective Martin knew that he was scared to death of something. There was only one telephone booth in the speakeasy, and Martin was determined that Linehan should not use that. Martin wanted to know who Linehan called, and if the call was a local one, it would be impossible to trace once the connection was broken. For that reason, the detective steered Linehan into the street, stalling him off with questions until they reached a drugstore that had a row of 4 booths. "We'll go in here," Martin said. "While you're calling up your friend, I'll get in touch with Donahue. He's still waiting for me uptown." Before he entered the booth, Martin noted the number and then sought the telephone at the farther end of the row. Then he called up headquarters and asked the operator to find out what number Linehan was talking to. While the operator was handling this, Martin got in touch with Donahue and told him briefly of his experience with the club owner. "He knows Whitey all right," Martin said. "I'm going to keep after him until I get the address." "You're darn right he knows Whitey," Donahue interrupted. "It was Whitey and Ulas stuck up his joint on 138th Street Sunday night.
when McGlynn got shot. Whitey's a desperate character, the girl told us, and Linehan's scared stiff of him. Headquarters have sent copies of his picture to the 20th Street station house. Can you meet me there in an hour?" "If I can't," replied Martin, "I'll leave a message there for you." He hung up and saw Linehan through the glass panel walking restlessly up and down the floor in the drugstore. "What'd you find out?" Martin asked him as he went over and took hold of Linehan's arm. "Wait till we get outside," Linehan said with a glance at the listening soda clerk. "Now quit stalling," Martin said as soon as they reached the sidewalk, "and quit lying. I know that Whitey and Ula held up your place Sunday night. Do you want to spill your piece here to me or down at headquarters with Inspector Coughlin?" Linehan shivered. In a bone-dry voice he answered, "I'd be safer in the can maybe than anywhere else just now, but there's a reason I don't want to be away from home for the next few weeks. Honest to God, I don't know Whitey's address. The man I met him through wasn't at his hotel when I called, and they said they didn't know when he would be." The man Linehan mentioned was of great assistance in the case. His name was Arthur Tisney, which is a made-up name, nothing like his real name or any of his aliases. Tisney's reputation is international. His specialty is the confidence game, and there isn't a more amoral rascal in the field. Without a scruple, he'll skin a sucker until he leaves nothing behind but bare bones. He'll flatter along a blue-haired belle until she believes she's regained her flapperhood, and then mulch her of every last nickel. Never give a sucker a break is his motto. Outside of business hours, however, he had a very strict idea of right and wrong. Martin was surprised to learn of Tisney's association with a thug like Whitey, for they moved in underworld circles which were as distant as Newport is from Coney Island. Had this been an ordinary case, Martin would have had little hope of gaining any information from the con man. But knowing him as he did, he was confident that Tisney would look on the cowardly action of the man who murdered Masterson as that of a cur who ought to be exterminated. Martin sent Linehan ahead of him to the hotel that had been mentioned as Tisney's address, and before following him he went to the station house on 20th Street and picked up Donahue. "Tisney must have fallen on lean times,"
Donahue remarked when Martin told him the name of the cheap hotel just off Broadway where they had to wait for the return of the confidence man. It certainly was a dismal hole. A down-at-the-heels leering sort of place with a small dismal lobby and a worm-eaten desk. Before entering, Martin called up headquarters and learned from the switchboard operator that this was the place that Linehan had telephoned to from the drugstore. There they sat for 2 solid hours. Cheap song and dance men, dizzy little starlets, has-been actresses, shabby chorus girls, and nondescript characters passed and repassed the 2 policemen. At 9:30, Tisney breezed in. Meticulously groomed as always, exceptionally good-looking, tall, broad-shouldered, he strolled through the doorway and glanced around the lobby. He spied Linehan and Martin. Martin noticed Linehan and Tisney's eyes clash, and at that moment he knew the club owner had sent someone to round up the confidence man, but had not warned him to expect company from police headquarters. However, with an almost imperceptible shrug, Tisney advanced and looked from one man to the other, the club owner and the policeman, with a quizzically questioning air. "These gentlemen want to talk to you," Linehan mumbled. Without any beating around the bush, Martin told him the exact story of the stick-up, sparing no detail of the brutal way in which Ula had killed the patrolman. "How do I know that everything you've told me is true?" Tisney asked quietly. "You can call up the Knickerbocker Hospital and find out," Martin told him. "I believe you," he said after a moment's thought. "Chair is too good for a beast like that. I'll do everything I can to help you. Listen, I met Whitey through a mutual acquaintance a couple weeks ago when I was looking for a reliable chauffeur. I was at the time planning to go in for bootlegging on a large scale. It was in the early hours of the morning, and he offered to drive me home. I insisted on driving him home, and he directed the taxi driver to drop him at 33 Covent Avenue. For reasons of my own, I made sure later on that this really was his address, and found out that he lived in apartment number 1, under the name Murray, sharing a room with another young fellow. Last time I saw him was Monday night around 1 o'clock in the morning at the Speakeasy on 96th Street, and he was with that chap they call Ula and 2 dames who looked like smart young matrons looking for an adventure." Tisney finished with an undisguised sneer, for none hold the unconventionalities of the upper classes more in disgust than the denizens of the so-called underworld. After some further conversation that convinced the detectives that Tisney had shared all he knew, Martin and Donahue left the hotel. From a nearby United cigar store, Martin telephoned Inspector Carey and briefly as possible made him acquainted with the situation. Carey then gave orders. "Let Linehan go. Tell him to come to headquarters tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock to see me. You and Donahue get right up to the place on Coven Avenue and crash in as quietly as you can. I'll arrange to have enough men there to surround the block before you arrive." It was 10:15 by the time Martin and Donahue reached the address Tisney had given them. At that hour, the street was practically deserted, and the scattered individuals that they did see, the detectives recognized as men from the precinct station. From the shadows of the basement entrance, two men detached themselves and sauntered across the street in the direction of the detectives. Under the arc light, Martin identified them as Brady and Teed. They had a short discussion. It was arranged that Donahue, a patrolman, and Martin should enter number 33 through the basement and open the front door. This would be a signal for at least half a dozen of the men to enter and crash the apartment together. On descending the steps that led to the basement, Martin and Donahue were pleasantly surprised to find the door open. Halfway along the narrow, well-lighted hall was a comfortably furnished office with a young man seated at a switchboard. "Is there an old man named Murray living in this house?" Martin asked him. "Not sure of the number, but I believe it's 33. "There's only one Murray living on this block," he answered, "and I wouldn't call him old. He's about 35 or thereabouts, and that's the only Murray on the block." "You sure about that?" Martin asked, as if disappointed. "Well, sure I'm sure," the boy grinned. "Because the switchboard serves the whole of the block. You see, there are only 2 apartment houses, and they're both owned by the same people."
"Oh," Donahue interrupted. "That's our friend's son. Do you know if he's in?"
"Well, I guess so." The telephone operator prepared to plug his key into the hole under the number 1. "I know he was in half an hour ago because he put a call through." That was what the detectives wanted to know. They disclosed their identity to the young man and swore him to secrecy, left the patrolman on guard, and tore upstairs, opening the front door. Through the door presently streamed Detectives Donnelly, Brady, Deneen, Enright, Overhouse, Henshaw, Mullins, and Patrolman Gray of the 5th Detective District. The police entered Whitey's apartment. Never mind how. To have rung the doorbell would have been madness. They didn't want to herald their arrival, for you can't expect to arrest a couple of dangerous gunmen without a fight, and the police wanted to take their prisoners to the station house alive, if possible. Whitey and his partner knew by that time that they were slated for the electric chair if they were caught, and they'd be willing, law enforcement presumed, to take desperate chances. Without any unnecessary noise, the police crashed the place and then swooped through the apartment with the velocity of a cyclone. A wild scream greeted their arrival.
"What do you want?"
They confronted a woman in her early 50s, crouching behind a chair in the living room. Stark terror stared from her eyes. "We're detectives," Martin told her, "and we want Murray and his companion."
"Well, they aren't here," she stuttered. "They left a half hour ago for Miami, Florida."
She gave her name as Schumann. She looked like an honest, refined woman, and the police were inclined to believe her story. That didn't prevent them from making a thorough search of the apartment and the dumbwaiter before they proceeded to put her through a very severe grilling, which no doubt she'd remember for the rest of her life. It didn't take the police long, however, to become absolutely convinced that the woman was completely horrified to learn that her roomers were a couple of killers and professional thugs. 2 men rented a room from her on November 25th, 1926, she said, and gave their names as Walter Murray and Pete Taylor. She didn't ask them for references, as they appeared to be a pair of nice, clean-cut young men. This very night they'd turned up at about 9:30 and hurriedly packed their belongings in one old brown leather suitcase before informing their landlady that they were leaving for Miami. Murray, she said, lived pretty steadily in the apartment, whereas his friend Taylor was often away overnight. "You have any idea where he went?" Martin asked her. The landlady shook her head. "No, but Mr. Murray often called up a number, something Boulevard. Now isn't that annoying? I have it right at the tip of my tongue and yet I can't get it. Maybe it'll come. Anyway, he used to say, 'Hello, Grace, is Pete there?' And sometimes Pete was, and often he wasn't. Then he'd try other numbers. Now, I wasn't listening, you understand. I just happened to hear when I was tidying up in the living room, so I couldn't tell you what else he said." In packing, the men had made a clean sweep. The only thing they left behind was a pocket handkerchief, which was found tossed under the bed. This was soiled as if someone had dusted off his shoes with it. It was an old handkerchief, and in the corner was a laundry mark. While Detective Martin was talking to Mrs. Schumann, Donahue had telephoned to the Pennsylvania and New York Central Railroad offices and learned that the only trains leaving for Miami that night were the 12:30 and the 12:40. Detectives had immediately left to cover both trains. Others were in the basement checking off all telephone calls put through by the 2 young men in Mrs. Schumann's apartment. Both Mrs. Schumann and the telephone operator identified photographs of Walter Tippy, alias Murray, alias Tip Murray, alias Whitey, and many other names as the men they knew. In digging through the numbers charged against Whitey's name, the police found the often repeated Boulevard Exchange call belonging to Mrs. Grace Peterson of 7038 Nansen Street, Forest Hills, Long Island, New York. That brought the cops out on thin ice. Why on earth, as Donahue asked the world in general, was a woman living in that aristocratic residential community associating with a crook like Whitey? If the oft-called Boulevard telephone number had brought police to the telephone of an underworld lady, there would have been swift and fruitful questioning around her neighborhood. But here was a woman of the upper world, of doubtless unimpeachable standing in her community, and police procedure would have to be circumspect. It was a puzzle for the time, unexplained until just before the end, although it's worth noting that Mrs. Peterson's connection with the case, although important, did turn out to be entirely innocent and accidental. Detective Winkleman of the Homicide Bureau and Detectives Jackson and Ambrose of the 5th District were immediately sent out to keep 7038 Nansen Street, Forest Hills, under constant surveillance. Martin and Donahue were disappointed but not surprised to learn that the men sent to cover the trains leaving for Miami had not recognized Walter Tippy, the man known as Murray or Whitey, nor had they recognized Pete Ula Taylor. Murderers make many mistakes, but seldom disclose their destination when fleeing. When they told their landlady they were headed for Miami, it was a near certainty that they were not headed for Miami. "It's a funny thing," Donahue remarked to Martin as they were about to part for the night. "It's a funny thing that Whitey and Ula cleared out just as Tisney was telling us their address. I wonder if anybody tipped them off." "I wonder if anyone called up the Knickerbocker Hospital from Forest Hills after 6:20, Martin mused. Before calling it a day, Martin mailed the soiled handkerchief special delivery to the Identification Bureau at headquarters. There it would be traced to the laundry that had placed the small ink mark on the corner. And so it was. A soiled bit of rag was the clue that would lead police to the more glittering and glamorous speakeasies glorified under the title of nightclubs, and help materially in sending a murderer to the electric chair. Dawn was breaking when Martin reached home, and it seemed as if he'd been asleep but a few moments when the telephone by the bed woke him with an ear-splitting clatter. "Winkleman speaking," Martin heard drowsily as he put the receiver to his ear. "At 4 in the morning of the 31st, the night of the murder, she arrived home with 4 men and a girl in an automobile. Whitey?" The connection was abruptly cut off. Furiously, Martin jiggled the receiver up and down. "Number, please," a sleepy saccharine voice requested.
You cut me off,
Martin roared at its invisible owner.
"The party disconnected,"
it retorted sweetly but firmly. "Then find out where the call came from," Martin ordered.
"Hold the wire, please. The call came from the pay station in Freeport, Long Island."
Martin looked at his watch. It was 6:30. He wanted to be present when Inspector Carey questioned Linehan at 8 o'clock, so it was no use going back to sleep. Whitey and his gang had something more than 3 million square miles of territory in the United States to hide in, but a gigantic dragnet was being spread out over the whole country. One slip, and they would be floundering in its meshes. The case was little more than 24 hours old, and police had a plethora of clues leading toward the trail of the murderers. Men were already quietly investigating every person whom either of the two had called on the telephone. Wardens of the various penitentiaries where Whitey had spent time would that morning receive letters requesting the names and addresses of all those to whom the highwayman had written while in the institution. The soiled handkerchief from under the bed might open up further leads. A night's thought had probably advised Linehan to come clean with all he knew. Altogether, things had started off with a bang, but would police reach the trail before it became cold? Retribution undreamed of follows swiftly in the fugitive footsteps of the ruthless killers of Patrolman Masterson. And if you want to find out what happens to them, please do join me this Thursday, June 8th, for Part 3 of It Was a Face Out of Hell, the shooting of Patrolman Masterson. Until then, thank you so much for joining me. I'm Zevin Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery.